This is year 2 for our side banding of enhanced efficiency fertilizers in spring wheat. It's supported by the province's Strategic Field Program with the guidance of Ali Noble with Saskatchewan Agriculture and Rich Farrow with the University of Saskatchewan. The trial is being conducted at our site here at Yorkton, along with Indian Head, Scott, Prince Albert, and Melfort. The objective of this trial is to determine if a product containing a nitrification inhibitor, in this case Entrench, or dual urease and nitrification inhibitor, i.e. Super U, can increase grain yield or grain protein in spring wheat relative to using straight urea. We are testing this at soil plus fertilizer N rates of 80, 120, and 160 pounds per acre. This gives us a better chance of finding that sweet spot where any loss in nitrogen is likely to be picked up as a loss in yield or grain protein. We're not measuring any gas emissions in this study, so we're relying on yield and grain protein differences to alert us to any nitrogen loss. Nitrogen can be lost through ammonia volatilization and denitrification, which releases dinitrogen gas, which is not a concern. We're bathing in 78% of it right now. But it also releases nitrous oxide, which is a greenhouse gas of concern. While deep banding nitrogen is generally accepted to prevent volatilization of ammonia, studies have shown that nitrous oxide emissions can be reduced from banded applications when side banding products containing a nitrification inhibitor, such as Entrench or Super U. However, in many of these studies, neither a yield or grain protein benefit could be observed. This implies to me that while nitrification products in the sideband may reduce nitrous oxide emissions by, well, let's say 50%, for example, the total N loss is not large enough to significantly impact yield. That is certainly what we found last year in our study. Neither Entrench containing a nitrification inhibitor or Super U containing both a urease and nitrification inhibitors could prevent enough nitrogen loss to move the needle on either yield or grain protein. When the products were side-banded deep, that is. However, in another experiment conducted last year, we found N loss could be prevented by using Super U when side-banding was shallow. While we couldn't detect a wheat yield difference, grain protein was significantly increased when Super U was used in the shallow sideband compared to straight urea. Shallow banding may occur when producers are trying to seed canola shallow or when purposefully trying to reduce the draft on equipment. The loss of nitrogen to volatilization can occur when banding urea shallow because there's not enough moist soil above the sideband to prevent the loss of ammonia. In fact, shallow banding of urea can result in more nitrogen loss than even surface broadcast applications. Now this may seem counterintuitive, but the tight band of urea when side banding raises the surrounding soil pH, which drives the ammonium to ammonia, which can then gas away. As an aside, using a product like Anvil, which just protects against volatilization loss, may have worked even better than Super U in this instance because Super U, unlike Anvil, is keeping the nitrogen in the ammonium form for longer by preventing nitrification. This, in turn, increases the period of time ammonium might convert to ammonia, which can then be lost to the air. Sidebanding urea with a nitrification inhibitor could also be more beneficial when seeding winter wheat, as that's when the fertilizer has lots of time in the fall to convert to nitrate and then sit in waterlogged soils the following spring, where it's at risk of denitrification or leaching. Anyway, enough of that bunny trail. Let's see if we observed any benefits in this trial from using enhanced efficiency fertilizer in a deep sideband. If we can't, it's going to be a hard sell to producers to use these products in the sideband without any incentives. Well, I'm afraid 2025 didn't bring us any evidence in terms of yield, grain protein, or nitrogen uptake to suggest there was more nitrogen available when sidebanding an enhanced efficiency N fertilizer over untreated urea. But let's look at the data from the last 2 years. When analyzing all site years together, a significant yield response to increasing soil plus fertilizer N was detected. But a site year by nitrogen interaction was detected, indicating that the response differed between the sites. When we look at the sites individually for 2024, we can see Melfort had a very strong and significant response. Responses were also significant at Indian Head and Yorkton, but yield increases were lower. At Prince Albert and Scott, yield responses to added nitrogen were not statistically significant. However, there is at least a numeric increase at Prince Albert. Looking at the yield data from 2025, Indian Head, Melfort, and Yorkton all have significant yield responses to increasing nitrogen. Again, Prince Albert only had a numeric increase. At Scott, yield significantly decreased at the highest rate of nitrogen. The reason for this is not completely clear, but it might have something to do with a significant decrease in plant population. There may have been some fertilizer seed safety issues, as increasing soil plus fertilizer N rates from 80 to 160 pounds per acre significantly reduced crop emergence from 253 to 209 plants per meter squared. However, most site years were responsive to added nitrogen, particularly in comparison with the no nitrogen checks, which I've left out of the figures because, well, they're not part of the factorial analysis. Similar to the yield data, we also had a significant grain protein response to added nitrogen when all site years were combined. Again, there was a significant nitrogen rate by site year interaction, telling us to look at all the responses on an individual site basis. In 2024, grain protein was significantly increased by increasing nitrogen rate at all locations. However, the magnitude of the response differed between locations. It was much more muted for Prince Albert, for example. In 2025, grain protein increased to varying degrees at all locations except Prince Albert, where no significant effects were observed. But overall, yield and grain protein were responsive to added nitrogen, which should give us a chance to detect a difference between products. We also looked at total nitrogen uptake by the crop, but I won't cover those results in this video because it's basically supporting the results that we obtained from the yield and grain protein data. Averaged across all site years, no significant differences between products were detected. There were no interactions between product and nitrogen rate to suggest the end response differed between products. And there was no interaction with site either. Here you can see every individual site for 2024. There are no significant differences between products at any site, so I didn't bother to put down any lettering. The story is exactly the same for every individual site in 2025. No significant yield differences between products. But what about grain protein? I've often seen protein differences in the absence of yield differences. Well, the story was much the same using the grain protein data. When averaged across nitrogen rate and site, no differences in grain protein were detected between the products. When we looked at each site individually, significant differences between products were not detected in 2024, and the same was true for the most part in 2025. The exception to this was at Indian Head, where protein was significantly lower when Super U was sidebanded. The reason for this is unclear. However, it's safe to say that sidebanding enhanced efficiency N fertilizers did not increase yield or grain protein. Okay, let's bring this home. Sidebanding in trench or Super U did not increase nitrogen use efficiency over untreated urea as measured by yield, grain protein, or nitrogen uptake, which I didn't bother to share with you. Any nitrogen loss prevention from sidebanding enhanced efficiency nitrogen fertilizers was too small to provide an agronomic benefit and would have incurred an economic loss. So financial incentives are going to be necessary if we want to encourage producers to adopt this practice. Thanks to Sustainable Cap for supporting this project.